Hello, welcome to the barn. My name is Joanne Knight. We're going to continue with this quilt that I was presenting to you in a series of barn buddies called Pay It Forward. And today we're going to look at the second block in this quilt, the one in the top right corner, and it is an applique block. And applique blocks can be a little tricky sometimes. They give us a little bit more work than sometimes we really want to put into one, and there's all kind of options to them. I'm going to show you what I decided to do with my applique block. This is a full picture of the finished quilting on this block. One of the things that I love the most about CreativeStudio version 7 is the introduction of being able to draw an arc with the head of the machine, because I come from an old hand applique background, and hand applique is just a series of curves. And with our new draw arc with the head of the machine, I have found that it is so much easier to do stitch in the ditch around applique. And I did a lot of stitch in the ditch on this particular quilt. So this piece right here was done stitch in the ditch on the machine first, and then I placed this corner pattern in each of the four corners of the block, filled it in with this little melon shaped pattern right here. It ended up being a little bit unusual look to the background of the block rather than just doing a standard fill. And I'm very much pleased with the way that it turned out, because you have the geometric lines that are combined with the little circles and ovals. So let me show you how I did this one. I have a tendency, it seems, to collect patterns. I have a lot of them. So one of the things that I did was make a collection for this quilt so that I could type in the name of my collection and it would pull up the patterns that I thought would work well in my quilt. That kept me a little bit more focused, and instead of looking through all of the patterns that I had, I could just focus on the ones that I thought would work for this particular project. I still had 622 patterns in the collection, but it did keep me from looking through all the edge-to-edge patterns and the different geometric patterns and the ones that I did not think that I would use in this particular quilt. So that might be a little thing that would help you whenever you are working on a particular project. This again is a look at the quilting on the first row, and this is the block that we're going to talk about right here, my little bell block with my applique. As with all of the blocks of this quilt, the first thing that I did was the stitch in the ditch along the outside edge of the block. I used draw line for that, and I stitched in the ditch all the way around the outside to kind of give me the parameters of that block and be able to stabilize that block a little bit. The next thing that I do once I get through with my stitch in the ditch of my block, and I can make as many clicks as I want to make going all the way around that block, and I would do this with the head of the machine. Once the stitch in the ditch is done, then I'm going to convert that stitch in the ditch to a boundary, and that gives me an exact boundary of that block as well as stabilizing it. The next thing that I did on this particular block was the stitch in the ditch around the little sunbonnet, the little bell that was in the center of it. I'm going to once again pull up this block, and I'm going to import this image into CreativeStudio so you can see exactly how I did that with Draw Arc. So I'm going to go to File, left click on Import Image, and I'm going to go to this PC and find my jump drive, because that's where my images are for this particular quilt. I'm going to change the view to extra large icons, And I'm going to go down and search for that image of that little bell block. And there she is right there. Left click on Open. CreativeStudio brings that image in on the point of origin just like it's used to doing. Now I'm going to go and grab my draw arc. I would be doing this with the head of the machine, and you want to make sure that your laser light is synced really well with your needle. Left click on draw arc. This is going to be a series of continuous arcs. So what my clicking is, the first click is my starting point, the second click is my height, and the third click is my ending point. Then my next click is the height again, and the next click is the ending point. I like very much that you are able to see where that pink line is going, and it just depends on how smooth that particular arc is as to whether I'm going to make one large click or whether I'm going to do shorter clicks. I can always go back and adjust that with my F9 anchors, or I can adjust it with my nodes, either one. Now this one I'm coming into an inside curve, so I'm going to once again click my height, and in this one I'm going to go all the way to this side right there. Right click to end that drawing function. F3 is your image attributes, and I'm going to make this image just a little bit less intense so that you can see exactly what I did on the drawing. If I decide that this one right here is not quite as close as I want it to be, I can hit my F7, or I can cycle through my anchors by doing a double left click and get my nodes and pull my node up just a little bit. It is also helpful if you want to, and if you're just starting to do this, you can run needle off to be able to make sure that that is going to follow that stitch in the ditch exactly the way it needs to follow it. This is the way that I do all of my stitch in the ditch now, and I have been real happy with the results of it and the way that it turns out. So that is the second thing that I did, was the stitch in the ditch around the little bell. I didn't need it for a fill, but I did want to go ahead and stabilize that applique first. Going back to my final quilting, the next thing that I did was place these corner patterns right here on this particular block. I'm going to go back to my project. This is my pattern that I use, so I'm going to drag it to the screen. These blocks were 9 inches, so I took this pattern and placed it, hit my space bar to rotate it around, and I placed it right in the corner, just ever so slightly off of this seam line that I did for my boundary. Remember, I made that into a boundary after I did my stitch in the ditch. I'm going to move it right in here into place so you can see what that looks like. And I sized it by using my F9 anchors and made it fit just around where I had that stitch in the ditch on that little bell applique. Pull it up just like this. What I was trying to do is stay a little bit off of the applique, but it was okay that this one went just a little bit underneath it. I was able to stop that if I wanted to. and place it just the place that I needed it to be, placing that pattern just like this. It wasn't a lot of rocket scientist here. I just wanted it to be somewhere in the vicinity. So once I had that done and the size that I wanted it to be, I need that pattern to be in the other 3 corners of that block. Once again, I sized my grid at 4.5 inches because the block was 9 inches. I'm going to select this pattern. I'm going to go to circular array, and Creative Studio is going to remember the last number that I used. I'm going to change that number to 4, move my mouse to the screen, and Creative Studio automatically connects those patterns. I'm going to uncheck connect, and I'm going to turn my grid snap on, and that's the reason why I wanted my grid sized at 4.5 inches, because if I hold down my left mouse button on this blue circle and just drag it somewhere close to that center grid line, Creative Studio will automatically snap that pattern to that grid line. I'm going to say OK, and when I do, it places those patterns exactly where I need them to be in those corners. Now I know that these lines are going to be directly across from each other. It will not sew continuously, but I'm okay with that. That does not bother me. The pattern wasn't intended to sew continuously because it really wasn't intended to be used in this particular manner. So I placed each one of these patterns and I quilted them out. Then it was nothing more than just going back and drawing a boundary, because remember, once the patterns are quilted, they may no longer be in the same spot on the quilt as they are on the computer screen because of shrinkage or whatever else is going on. So I drew a boundary of what was my available position, then just dragged this pattern to the screen and positioned it in that available spot. Use my F10 anchors, scroll in really close, put that pattern right there. I made them a little bit more oval to be able to fill up the space a little bit. I could do the same thing with circular array again. Do circular array, disconnect them, turn my grid snap back on by hitting the letter G on my keyboard. Pull those patterns right there and say OK, and position them according to the boundaries. I did draw a new boundary for each one of these sections, position them in the correct place, quilt those out, and that little block was done. And then I decided, well, no, it's not really done, because it had this open spot in the center, and you can see that I thought that that was a little bit too much of an open spot. So I just pulled in this pattern right here, which was just a roundabout, a modern Greek key, and placed it in the background and just did a little dividing on it to come up with a couple of lines to be able to quilt behind this little girl. And that was nothing more than just quilting in those lines and dividing that out just to give it just a little bit of final definition behind her, because I didn't want her to look like she was just kind of in the Never Never land there. Quilt that out, and now it really is done. This once again is a picture of the block and what it looked like. I hope you can tell that it would have been just a little bit too much space to leave open right here. I did quilt over this little black yarn on the bottom, and because I was using that Superior Micro Quilter thread, it really didn't hurt it any to quilt over it, but it just filled up that little bit of space there and gave it a little bit of added definition. So that's your second block on my quilt. And until next time, thank you for joining me.